Welcome everyone to our third of 4 Borders and Migrations Initiative events for fall 2020. I want to remind everyone that our last event will be next Monday. That event is about Mexican perspectives of migration, and that event will be in Spanish. As usual, all our events are free, open to the public, and currently live streamed and recorded for access later. If you want to access any of our past panels, you can do so from the Borders and Migrations webpage, which is easy to find. Just Google Canisius Borders and it pops right up. I want to thank our sponsors for this event and for the series of events this semester, including the Alana Student Center, the Office of Academic Affairs, the Departments and Programs of Modern Languages, Literatures and Cultures, International Relations, and Sociology, the program in Campus Ministry, the Office of Mission and Identity, and the SEEP Scholarship Program, which provides me the student labor to do the posters, and of course, the tech support for these events. And then I want to give a shout out to Corey Turbin, who has been my tech guru through all of these things. And without him, these things would not have happened. We have with us today 3 panelists that we're going to go in order in which I am introducing them to talk about COVID-19 and its impact on migration. And inevitably, I'm sure we'll also end up talking about the election. We have with us first up Caitlin Marie Ward, who earned both her bachelor's and master's degrees from Georgetown University in English and Latin American Studies, respectively. And after completing her undergraduate studies, Caitlin Marie worked at Georgia Legal Services through the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, where she was first introduced to migration issues, serving as a paralegal on cases involving agricultural workers in the United States on temporary work visas. While pursuing her master's degree, Caitlin Marie also interned for the Office of Justice and Ecology, where she supported advocacy efforts on key issues related to human rights in Central America and US immigration policy. As the Senior Advisor on Migration with the Office of Justice and Ecology, Caitlin Marie develops and coordinates advocacy efforts to protect immigrants' rights, promote comprehensive humane immigration reform, and address human rights concerns, particularly in Latin America. Welcome, Caitlin Marie. After that, we will have Jarrett Onelas, who is a Jesuit information and also a former Jesuit volunteer in Belize. From Turlock, California. He earned his bachelor's in Chicano Studies and Spanish at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a master's in philosophy and social science from the ITESO in Guadalajara, Mexico. He worked for 4 years for the FM4 Paso Libre Migrant Center in Guadalajara before starting with Kino Border Initiative in Nogales. He is the education coordinator at KBI, where his responsibilities include organizing and facilitating immersion experiences and educational events with schools, universities, and churches, as well as assisting in the day-to-day responsibilities at the Comedor. Welcome, Jarrett. And a shout out to KBI because that's one of our partners with campus ministry at Canisius. And next up then we have Kara Stratton, who is a volunteer and founding member for Justice for Migrant Families here in Buffalo, focusing on housing support and post-release plans, ensuring that people who are detained or otherwise impacted by immigration enforcement can find shelter in communities to support them. She also coordinates court support, provides trainings on volunteer opportunities, has served as chair of the board and liaisons with different national and regional organizations to advocate for the abolition of the immigrant detention center system and the creation of a just immigration system. Welcome, Kara. So we're going to start with Caitlin to give us a sort of broad national perspective. Then Jarrett will talk about events and impacts on the southern border, more specifically, and Kara will bring it locally to here in Buffalo, and then we'll open it up for questions. Those of you viewing can submit questions via the YouTube chat and the phone number that appears on the YouTube channel for this. So thank you all. And Caitlin, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to Canisius for inviting me to speak today. As Richard said, I'll do a policy overview, and then I'll let the other speakers kind of bring the issues home with their on-the-ground experience. So let me start at the southwest border of the United States, and then I'll move north from there. So let's start with the Remain in Mexico policy. For those who are unaware, it's a policy that was announced in January of 2019, and it essentially says that the US government, Department of Homeland Security, may return people to Mexico to await the outcome of their asylum proceedings. About 65,000 people have been returned to Mexico under this policy. There are around 20,000 that still remain. Many people have, some may have been paroled into the United States. Many others, though, have just given up on their cases after months and months and months of waiting and just not seeing an end in sight, being concerned about safety issues, et cetera. They've decided to give up on their cases. So there are about 20,000 people, more or less, who remain in Mexico as a result of this policy. They have been severely impacted by COVID in a number of different ways. From a US policy standpoint, the Department of Justice, which houses the immigration courts in the United States, announced in July that all of the hearings for the Remain in Mexico policy would be postponed until 3 conditions were met. California, Arizona, and Texas needed to progress to phase 3 of the reopening plans. State Department and CDC needed to lower their global health advisory regarding Mexico to a level 2, and the government of Mexico, which uses a stoplight system, they would need to categorize all of the Mexican border states as yellow in their evaluation system. So all 3 of these situations needed to be met in order for the hearings to start again. So what that has meant is that people are even more in limbo now, stuck in Mexico, in very dangerous border towns. Some are able to find shelter in places that are run mostly by faith-based organizations, but many others are forced to live in tent cities on the border. I can show a picture quickly of one such border, one such tent city. So this is the tent city in Matamoros, Mexico. And so you can see the number of challenges that they're facing, just, psychologically not knowing when hearings will start again and what's next for them in their immigration proceedings. But also, of course, from a health perspective, there's no social distancing going on. There's just not the facilities for sanitation. And so it's just quite a number of challenges that people are facing who are subject to this Remain in Mexico policy. So there's been a clear appropriation by the Trump administration of the pandemic to further their anti-immigration policies. The northern and southern borders of the United States have actually been closed to all non-essential travel since March. Sadly, seeking asylum is not considered essential travel. More than 200,000 migrants, including unaccompanied minors and asylum seekers, have been expelled from the US southern border since March. They have had no opportunity to present an asylum claim. They are simply returned to Mexico, whether or not that is the country from which they came. They are just systematically returned without any opportunity to make a claim for asylum. The US government has justified this policy in saying that it is necessary to protect public health, which is ironic given that other travel has continued. Commerce, for example, has continued back and forth across the border. So there's been lots of travel and potential carriers of the virus that have gone back and forth. But the border remains closed to asylum seekers for public health reasons. The other irony of this is that deportations from the United States have also continued, and they've in fact helped spread the virus from the United States to other countries. Data from the Guatemalan government showed that the US deported around 6,000 people to Guatemala between March and September, and of that, 331 people tested positive for COVID after arriving in Guatemala. We saw a big step up in deportations right before the elections. For example, there were 12 flights to Haiti that were recorded in October, which is a huge step up from the 1 to 2 flights every couple of weeks that were standard. It's not at all surprising that people who are deported would then be testing positive for COVID upon landing in their home countries, because immigration detention centers have become hotspots for the virus. I want to share a clip of an individual that was interviewed actually by Kino, and that we featured in a campaign that my office did with several other Jesuit partners called Solidarity Across Borders, in which we were trying to encourage greater solidarity with migrants throughout the Jesuit network by featuring several stories of migrants who are impacted not just by COVID, but U.S. immigration policies in general. So here's a clip of a gentleman who was detained in Arizona and eventually decided to request his deportation because he was so fearful of remaining in a detention center where there was an outbreak of COVID. So there are over 7,000 people who have tested positive for COVID since testing began in February, detainees, that is, since ICE began testing in February. Currently, there are 384. And there are 384 positive cases that are currently in custody, and and 8 people have passed away after testing positive for the virus. So let me shift now to the interior. I think that there's this fallacy in thinking that COVID is somehow this great equalizer. You know, everybody from Boris Johnson and Tom Hanks are getting COVID to, you know, some ordinary person's grandmother. But if we consider who is most vulnerable to the virus, how severe his or her symptoms are, and what forms of relief are available, we can really see how the virus actually exacerbates pre-existing inequalities and injustices. In terms of who's most vulnerable, I would say that undocumented workers are at the top of that list. There are many undocumented workers who are essential workers. The Center for American Progress estimates that about 5 million undocumented workers are doing jobs that are deemed essential to the nation's critical infrastructure. For example, almost 20% of food processing workers and almost 40% of agricultural workers are undocumented. I think another good indication, and let me share my screen again, of the role that undocumented immigrants play in essential jobs and critical infrastructure is if we look at remittances. So this is data that was analyzed and put together by the Pew Research Center. It's remittances from the US to 6 countries in Latin America. Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are included in this list. So to kind of quickly summarize what the data says, you can see how the remittances are significantly lower in April of 2020 than they were in April of 2019. April is kind of when everything in the country shut down, so it makes sense that remittances would fall so significantly. But once the country started to open back up slightly, we see the remittances make a very quick recovery. And I think that, you know, this data includes more than undocumented workers, and so it's not exclusive or definitive evidence of the contributions that undocumented workers are, but of course they're included in this. And I just think that it's significant that their remittances should recover so quickly, and in fact be more in June 2020 than they were of 2019. It just indicates how many immigrants are out there continuing to work during the pandemic and serving in essential roles. And you know, this is critical for countries, particularly in the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, where remittances equaled about 20% of GDP in 2019. So one of the people that was featured in the Solidarity Across Borders campaign is an essential worker herself. She's undocumented. We refer to her as Claudia to protect her identity. She has picked apples in the state of Washington for about 20 years. And so I'll just play her clip here briefly. Was everyone able to hear? Sorry, Richard, you're.
Yeah, sorry. We couldn't hear it, but we could see it, and the subtitles were present. So.
Okay. Sorry about that. Anyway, at least you were able to read the subtitles. Maybe it's because of my headphones. Anyway, so you might have heard or read Claudia's reference to checks that were given out. What she's referring to are the stimulus checks that were a part of the CARES relief package that Congress passed a ways back now in the springtime as the latest relief package. The stipulation for the individual stimulus checks, though, was that you had to file your taxes with a Social Security number. And if you filed with a spouse, then both people had to have a Social Security number. As an undocumented worker, Claudia didn't have a Social Security number, and so she didn't receive any relief out of the CARES Act. Her two children are U.S. citizens, but they also were left out of relief because their parent doesn't file taxes with a Social Security number. In the end, about 2 million U.S. citizens were left out of relief of the CARES package, out of this stimulus checks, because they were maybe the spouse of they were a U.S. citizen but married to somebody who didn't have a Social Security number and filed taxes jointly, and so they were completely left out, as well as any U.S. citizen children of individuals who don't have a Social Security number. So it's this very sad situation where somebody like Claudia, who is picking the fruit that is sent to our grocery stores around the country, she's allowing us to do exactly what we're doing now and working from home and connecting via Zoom. And she's out there working. She actually got COVID. Thankfully, she's recovered, but she's sacrificing so much so that we can live comfortably, and yet she's denied any benefits available through any of the COVID relief packages. So overall, sort of concluding thoughts, the policies that we're seeing out of the U.S. government have sent a very clear message that immigrants are expendable, that you're welcome here if you're willing to be exploited, but don't ask for anything in return. Just an overall sense of that some people's lives matter more than others. Some people's lives are simply valued more than others. Very tough situation, and immigrants are definitely some of the most impacted by COVID.
Thank you, Caitlin Marie, for that brief introduction to these issues. I think what we'll do is we'll continue with the presentations, and then we'll do Q&A after all three have presented. So next up, we have Jarrett, who's going to give us insight into what's happening more specifically at the southern border.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Caitlin, for that great presentation. What I'm going to share piggybacks a lot on a lot of that policy overview that we received from Caitlin Marie. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can everyone see the screen share? Okay. So I'll give a little overview of who we are at Kino Border Initiative and what we do, and then I'll talk about the situation with COVID on the border. So Kino Border Initiative is a joint project by 5 different organizations that was founded in Nogales in 2009. It's a partnership between the Mexican province, the West province of the Jesuits, the Missionary Sisters of the Eucharist, a Mexican religious order, sisters, and the Diocese of Tucson and of Hermosillo. And here's our mission and vision statement. Let's see, do I have to, there. I'll give people a few minutes or a little bit to read that. And basically what it boils down to is we want to see an immigration system that works for the people that we serve. And our mission statement details how we plan to make that a reality. Through direct humanitarian assistance and accompaniment with migrants, what we do here at the Comedor, social and pastoral education with communities on both sides of the border. So that includes calls like this and immersions, as Canisius College has been one of our most faithful partners over the years. And then participation in networks that engage at the local and regional, national levels and international levels. I'm working right now with a number of networks in Latin America of human rights defenders that work especially with immigrants. We really aim to serve the whole person here at KBI. Right now, we offer food, medical, legal, and psychological services. There's a job training program that's being started by another Jesuit scholastic, and that helps people find jobs regardless of their status here in Mexico. And there's also spiritual accompaniment that we offer. So in 2019, when we were at our old Comedor, and these are pictures from our old Comedor, we would serve 2 meals a day to migrants, asylum seekers, and deportees. And in September of 2020, we were at 96% of where we were in 2019. So it looks like there hasn't been too much of a change, but that number can be a little deceiving. In January and February of 2020, we were serving way more people than we were in 2019. But in March, there was a 5,000 meal drop, or about a third of what we were serving last year. The pandemic really has thrown a curveball to our institution. We've relied on really an army of volunteers from both sides of the border to make this project possible. And with the pandemic, we had to ask volunteers not to come, and we were really working with a bare bones staff. So staff people, we would all help out with serving, with preparing, with cleaning up the meals. And then the second half of the day, we could do our individual jobs and responsibilities. Now we have 2 long-term volunteers and a few other low-risk local volunteers that come. How we changed is, instead of the family-style meals that we had in the last slide, what we've been doing is giving away Tupperware to migrants and based on family size, and 1 person per family comes in the morning and receives enough food for the day. And I'm just going to give a little breakdown of who we serve here, and it's really a constantly changing reality. As you can see from the numbers in August, very, very different from the rest of the year. And that constantly changing reality has to do with the types of migration that we have. For example, in August, we had 32% of the people we served were from Cuba, almost as much as the people from Mexico. That number dropped down again in September and October, but those Cubans had been traveling, most of them, for over a year. So COVID has something to do with it, but COVID isn't causing all the migration that we see. Really, coronavirus exacerbated an already dangerous situation at the border. I'll talk a little bit about January and February to give a little context. There were a number of programs going on that were very much anti-immigrant. First, the Remain in Mexico MPP that we already heard about, but there was also and continues to be asylum metering. So what that means is that if you were to present yourself at a port of entry asking for asylum, back when asylum was still offered, for the last couple of years, the people at the port of entry would tell you have to get in line. And what does that mean? There's an unofficial list here in Nogales. Each border city is different, but there's an unofficial list where people sign up, because the Customs and Border Protection every morning will say, today we're accepting 6 people. Today we're accepting 5 or 3 or nobody today or 8 today. And so families and people would get on this list, so that way they wouldn't have to be just waiting on the border as on a first come first served basis. And they could go to shelters and they can access services here in the city. But that list means that you have to wait, even before getting a credible fear hearing, 2 to 3 months was what it was at when the border was closed. We already talked a little bit about the border closure, and how closure is really a term that I use in quotation marks, because the border isn't really closed. It's closed to people with certain types of visas. It's closed to asylum seekers, but it's not closed to permanent residents or are citizens. And as Kayla and Marie said, officially it's closed to people, to non-essential travel. But that's really not the case. I cross every single day. And when I was in Mexico, I just got back from Guadalajara, as Richard was talking about. I lived there for the last 4 years. When I came up to Arizona for the first time, I was really worried about the border being closed and they were going to ask me all these questions. And I had to wait 3 hours in line to cross. But I went through without so much as a temperature check. And now I cross every day without any kind of temperature check. There's no one stopping people from crossing in if you're a US citizen. So the closure is very much depends on who you are. And COVID, like I said, exacerbates a lot of the problems that were already present under MPP. The ongoing delays in court hearings, that's just exacerbated because now people who had been waiting face an indefinite wait. The travel here in Nogales, people under MPP have to go to, usually have to go to Juarez, which is a ways away. And there are cases of people who went there in March for their hearing, only to find out that with the closure, their case was postponed, and so they spent all the time, all the money to cross like most of the northern Mexico, and were turned away. Failure to respect non-refoulement, like one of the keystones of human rights legislation in the UN. Non-refoulement right now just doesn't exist. People fearing a return to their home countries, but also fearing returns to Mexico, who received threats in Mexico, received human rights abuses here in Mexico, are still returned. And yeah, I want to really highlight what Caitlin was saying, that when we think of COVID as this great equalizer, it's not. And for this, I want to mention a definition of racism that I think is really helpful. It comes from Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She says, racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Now, that's a really kind of wordy definition, but what it's saying in its root is racism isn't in its core about skin color. It's not in its core about an interpersonal interactions of someone called someone a bad name. It's how society decides whose lives matter and whose lives are disposable. And here at the border, we've seen in COVID really an exacerbation of this group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. If you don't have the right papers, you are much more vulnerable to dying here of COVID or of starvation, of human rights abuses than if you have a different set of papers. And that's something that we're trying to fight against. One of the big projects that we've been working on here at KBI is the Save Asylum campaign with other organizations in the border. Here, it's really being organized by asylum seekers and allies on both sides of the border. And since the beginning of August, we've held 4 binational rallies with interactive live streaming and calls to action. And I want to highlight this because we can very easily fall into this narrative that migrants or asylum seekers are these poor, passive, powerless victims. And really, that doesn't describe anyone that I work with. And it's as dehumanizing a narrative as something that comes out of or has come out of the administration in the last 4 years of migrants as rapists and murderers and threats to the well-being of the country. And here we've seen migrants take a stand to stand up for their rights and to share their testimony with the world. We're really, really hopeful for this next administration. They've promised a lot of things, like the end of MPP, the end of asylum metering, the end of safe third-party agreements, but we're continuing to organize here to hold the new administration accountable to their promises. So I'm going to close with some invitations to take action. Go to saveasylum.org. It's the website for our campaign. And if you can, write to your Congress people, your representatives, your senators, opposing more money being funneled into ICE and CBP, push to rebuild our asylum system, and then to co-sponsor the First Act. The First Act is a piece of legislation championed by Cory Booker and Jayapan. I'm blanking on her name. That is pushing to get people out of detention during this pandemic. So thank you.
Thank you, Jared, for that overview of what is happening at the southern border. And we do have questions coming in, but before we get to that, I'd like to turn things over to Kara to give us a perspective on how these things are impacting us here in Buffalo. So Kara.
Great, thank you, Richard and Caitlin Marie and Jarrett and all the work you do, and Canisius for hosting this Borders and Migrations panel. So just briefly, I volunteer with Justice for Migrant Families. We began in October of 2016 in response to the biggest workplace raids that had occurred in Western New York. Over 40 people were impacted, and large groups of community members, faith organizations, and community organizers came together to try, in solidarity with the people whose livelihoods had been taken away, whose family members had been detained, children had been taken away, to try to figure out how to support them. We do direct support, advocacy, and organizing to create systemic change in the immigration system. And just briefly, I wanted to give some local context because a lot of people, including myself, several years ago, didn't really understand how big an impact immigration, ICE, and Border Patrol have in the Western New York and Buffalo area. So Western New York and Buffalo, this is a northern border city. Because this is a border city, there are different rules for that ICE and Custom Border Patrol has to follow. So just there's many examples of this, but 2 examples: 100 miles from the border, Border Patrol, part of Customs Border Patrol, they can stop your car with minimal evidence. 20 miles from the border, and this is all of Buffalo basically, Border Patrol is allowed to go on private property without a warrant. So in Buffalo, there is 1 immigration court, and there's 1 immigration court inside a detention facility in Batavia that I'm going to be talking about soon. Everyone who is in immigration proceedings who resides north of Hudson, New York, has to attend the immigration court in Buffalo, and also everyone who has been released from Batavia and who has then gone on to, live anywhere in the country. So some people are coming 300, 500 miles to come to a court hearing here. There is also an ICE headquarters that where people are required to do check-ins, and that has a holding cell. And just to rub this in, it's located at 250 Delaware Avenue in the Delaware North Building, which houses the Westin Hotel and also a really fancy restaurant. And then 40 minutes outside of Buffalo, in Batavia, there is an immigrant detention facility. It is called the Buffalo Federal Processing Center, which, again, to pay attention to that name, it is the name indicates that people are processed there, not that they're held for 2, 3, 4, 5 years at a time. It is one of 2 federal detention facilities in New York State. The other is in New York City. That's the Varick Street Processing Center. And it has a capacity of 650 people. Right now, its capacity is at much less, probably around 300. There are 8 units there. 7 of them are for men and 1 is for women. And the people who are held there are asylum seekers, people who have had some kind of prior criminal convictions or charges, who have either served their time or not been convicted at all, but just have been charged and are taken directly from court or jail. People picked up often while driving. People who try to seek asylum in Canada and are turned back and immediately detained. People who have overstayed visas, whether that's for work or school or visiting. There are people there who have taken a wrong turn when driving down Niagara Street and ended up on the Peace Bridge, and then are processed and put into detention. So these are people who are being held on civil charges. Because of that, they do not have the same constitutional rights as someone who is convicted as a criminal. They do not have guaranteed access to a free attorney. They do not have the right to a speedy trial. They don't have a right to even a free phone call. The units inside Batavia in the detention facility are open floor like dorm units. Most do not have doors on the cells. Everything is shared. There are about 70 people per unit. All meals and almost all activities take place within these units. And there are very few activities, again, because this is not designed as a place for long-term holding. It is not supposed to be a place of punishment, although it is designed according to how prisons are designed. So that is to say that it is very much like a prison, except there's nothing to do. There's very few activities there. There's very few structured things. There's very little access to anything. Most of them are on lockdown for 12 to 18 hours a day. They have sporadic access to the outside, a very ill-equipped library, and before COVID, before the pandemic, the reports we would get of abuses were of medical neglect, insufficient and or inedible food, and extremely long detention times, no understanding of what the legal process was, what was to come, and the working conditions. There right now is a lawsuit going on, but people inside the detention facility work for $1 a day, most of them. They can choose to, but if they do not choose to do so, there are repercussions for that. So since the pandemic, we had a visitation program that has been shut down, and all visitation programs in the country were shut down by ICE shortly after the pandemic began. Previously, every weekend, volunteers, including many wonderful Canisius students, would drive out to Batavia to visit someone who had requested a visitor. And this would provide community support and connection for the person being detained while that person is in an extremely isolated situation. It would also educate community members about the realities of immigrant detention through this kind of personal relationship and connection. So as of today, people who are detained are not allowed to receive visitors. Legal visits also are very limited right now. So this extreme isolation, this disconnection from the community is even more pronounced. People are very far away from their families. Batavia is in a rural area. It is not easy to get to. There is one bus station and the buses are infrequent. And they're just torn away from their families and friends and communities. So they report feeling very invisible, very forgotten. Outside connection is vital to provide a sense of solidarity, but also to be able to report any abuses and illnesses and any needs. So right now, a lot of our work is focused on running a phone line that allows people to call, as well as their families and communities. And that has become the main medium of connection. However, people who are detained have to pay to call out. So we also provide commissaries. People who are detained have to pay for almost everything. The company, it's Akima Global Solutions, is the company that owns and runs the Federal Detention Center. So they are the ones that both pay the people $1 an hour and they run the store at which they have to buy all of the things. So some general costs, these are for, asylum seekers do not come with wads of cash they are then allowed to take into the detention center. So some general costs, it's 7 cents per minute to call inside New York State. It's 15 cents a minute to call a landline internationally, 35 cents to call cell phones internationally, $6 for half an hour video visitation. It is around $6 for toothpaste, $3 for a bar of soap, $4 for a package of ramen, and they eat a lot of ramen to supplement insufficient food. So when the pandemic first began, organizers pushed to get the facility to allow people to make free phone calls. Now people who are detained do have a limited number of free phone calls a week. People there are given a small hotel room sized bar of soap, and they do not have regular access to PPE. When they are released on bond, and just FYI, an inexpensive bond issued by the court inside Batavia is $10,000. And it is very rare to get such a bond, to get bond at all. So when they are released, they are not given a mask or hand sanitizer. They do not usually have money with them for bus tickets, phone chargers, and when COVID was at its height, they were unable to go into the bus station, which is also a gas station, to wait for buses. And again, buses come infrequently in this small rural town. So for the protection of the workers at the gas station, people were not allowed in. So people were just standing outside without proper clothing and no way to really get anywhere. When people get ill from COVID, they are put into quarantine, which there and in most immigrant detention facilities means solitary confinement. So solitary confinement was used prior to this for mental health crises and for punishment. If people didn't sign certain papers, often they reported that they were put into solitary confinement. It should, of course, not be used at all. And it is not a good way to deal with people who are sick with COVID. In the spring, there were over 45 cases reported inside Batavia of COVID. And at some point, this is according to Freedom for Immigrants, that has been compiling a lot of data from different detention facilities. ICE seems to have stopped testing, or at least reporting a lot of test results out of facilities. Last week, there was another reported case. And again, that person got put into solitary. So again, even in the midst of the pandemic, people were living in bunk bed style dorm rooms. There's no ability to socially distance. It is a public health crisis for the people who are detained there and for the people who work there. And as well, Caitlin Marie spoke about this, but there have been an increased number of deportations, an increased number of transfers between facility, and that has increased the spread of COVID. So 2 weeks after the pandemic began, people came in from county jails in New York and New Jersey. And then shortly thereafter, people were transferred to different detention facilities in Louisiana and Texas, where again, the numbers spiked in those facilities. Around the end of March, a group of people who were inside Batavia came together after going on a hunger strike to call attention to conditions there. And they wrote this statement, which they asked us to release to the media. And so if anyone is interested in the full statement, it is very long and detailed and wonderfully written. It is available online. If you Google, please hear our voices or Batavia detention facility, any of the news reporting from around there, or I could probably send links to people. So I wanted to end with their words about what it is like to live there right now, and also to call attention to what Jarrett said, quoting Ruth Wilson Gilmore, about the very real awareness that they have about their lives not being valued, that they are disposable people in this impossible situation, that they're trapped there. So in this statement, they pointed out that, again, they're being held in civil custody, that they're there for many, many different reasons, that their imprisonment is basically for the profit of contractors and corporations. They talked about the constant change of shifts of different workers inside the facility and any lack of safety precautions. And they said, "We are sons and fathers, wives and mothers, brothers and sisters, grandfathers and grandmothers, friends and loved ones of others. Would the president own our deaths? How much longer would these cruel and inhumane immigration policies and laws result in suffering and eventual death? To be left to contract this disease and die without being able to see or say something to our loved ones is our sad reality."
Thank you, Kara, for that very sobering portrayal of what's happening in our own backyard. We have several questions here. Some are directed specifically at different panelists and some are more general. We'll start with one that asks if you see or anticipate a shift in immigration thanks to COVID. In other words, once there's a sense of normalcy in terms of infection and control of infection, do you see an increase? And if so, do you see an increase from countries we have not seen large numbers from? I think this is related to the fact of the economic impact of COVID in other countries.
I can start. I think that we should expect to see an increase in immigration. I think we probably will see an increase in immigration from the usual countries, the usual suspects. But I'd say, actually Mexico, there are more people returning to Mexico than there are coming from Mexico. We might, that trend may not reverse, but I think it's likely that we'll see a greater migration from Mexico. Latin American countries have been severely hit economically by this pandemic. So I think that we should expect that that migration would continue and probably increase. And I would just point to the current numbers. The numbers went way down in April. But if you look at CBP's website, you can see the latest numbers for October are posted, I believe, and you know, they're like, I think 49,000, and that's actually higher than the day that Trump took office. Not hugely, but I think it's a difference of about 42,000 versus 49,000. So we already see that migration has not stopped because of COVID. It has not stopped because the border is closed to asylum seekers. And you know, Latin America has been severely hit by COVID. They're some of the worst off countries in the Western Hemisphere. So I would anticipate seeing an increase in immigration, and we're already seeing that. And the pandemic is ongoing, and you know, here in the U.S. we're entering a second phase, and we see no slowdown in migration.
Right. Thank you, Caitlin Marie. Jared, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I'll echo Caitlin Marie's analysis. I don't think people are going to wait. People are already coming up. A number of the deportees that I've talked to, some from Chiapas, who have said, I just can't afford to live in my hometown anymore because everything's closed because of COVID. Or people, there was a couple with two children from Guatemala who had been facing extortion and death threats from the gangs because they couldn't pay the rent, the gang taxes, the war taxes as they're called there, because of COVID. So are people fleeing because of COVID? Are they fleeing because of violence? It's a mix. Fleeing because of other economic issues that were already there. Yeah, I don't think people in those cases where it's really life or death, or the situation is unsustainable. Yeah, people aren't going to wait until a solution comes, numbers go down, because I don't think they can wait that long.
Right, right. Jared, this is a question for you related to a slide you showed about the country of origin of the immigrants. And they're wondering why there was such a large number of Cubans at one particular time, and how are they traveling there to the border?
Yeah, Cubans are mostly fleeing. They're mostly political asylum seekers, and they travel. They have a really interesting way of traveling. They leave from Cuba and usually end up either they can get a visa to Nicaragua is the most common place, but other places include Honduras or Panama. And from there, they usually get coyotes to take them to the Mexican border. And most Cubans get what's called a humanitarian visa in Mexico, which allows them to stay in Mexico and travel freely through Mexico for 1 year and also work in Mexico. But the people who have gotten this, most of them have already asked for asylum here in Mexico and been turned down, and have been held in really, really terrible detention conditions that really rival what we heard about, unfortunately, with Kara. But one group told me the immigration official told them, I mean, you're wasting your time. We don't give asylum to Cubans. And that was that. And sure enough, none of them have received asylum. But they received this 1 year visa, which usually it's not a year. They turn it in like 3 or 4 months after the date that it's issued. And during that time, they make their way up to the northern border, and they're here waiting for asylum to processes to begin again. I haven't met a Cuban yet who said that they are willing to try and cross the border through the desert. Most people want to wait. The problem is most have been waiting so long that those one-year visas are expiring. And when they're getting close to expire, employers don't like to give them work, because for them to, they can, with a job, they can get a work visa here, and that's a longer term solution. But employers, not all of them are registered with Mexican immigration to do that. And then also a lot of them just don't like to do the paperwork.
Thank you. This question is for both Jarrett and Caitlin Marie, about how did your year of service, your Jesuit volunteer year of service, impact you and your decisions to do the work that you do?
I would say that I initially took the job because I was just looking for an opportunity to use Spanish and develop my Spanish speaking skills. And so I was just not necessarily looking for something that was migration specific, but looking to work with an immigrant population to practice Spanish. And I didn't know anything about the H-2A program. I didn't know anything about guest worker programs in the United States. And I just found the whole thing really fascinating, infuriating for how exploitative the system is. And it just was the reason I wanted to continue learning about it. I wanted to continue working in that field. And so that was what inspired me then to go get a master's in Latin American studies, to understand better what are the conditions that are pushing people to migrate and to take these very exploitative jobs. And so I would say that there's a very direct line from my experience in JVC to where I am today.
Thank you. What about you, Jarrett?
I'd say my line is a little less direct. Yeah, I did JVC for 2 years in Belize, and I used that. I worked in high school and junior college there, a Jesuit high school and junior college, and then in the youth wing of the prison, the one prison that exists in that country. And I actually used that time to kind of discern if the Jesuits were for me or not. I went to public school my whole life. I had never really met a Jesuit until I did JVC. And so in that way, you can say, yes, that it kind of led me to join the Jesuits, and that's brought me here to the border.
Kara, what motivated you to get involved?
Gosh, I had been involved in various kinds of activism in different areas of my life for a long time. And sorry, it's echoing. And then, can you hear me without the echo? Okay. And then I just, after the workplace raids, I contacted my friend Jennifer and asked what I could do, and started teaching ESL in a local church, just to give people a way to structure their days and something to do. And now I'm in very deep. So, yeah.
So a question for all three of you. How do you take care of yourselves emotionally, mentally, to keep doing this difficult work?
I got this one. I can start. I'm really good at it. I've had to develop the skills because I kept going through cycles when I first started this work of just going all in and burning out over and over and over again. So I have to turn off my phone at a certain time. I have like very strict kind of like, I go to bed at a certain time, I wake up, I have like routines where I exercise and am outside. It's like almost all of the rest of my day when I'm not working is like nice, comforting things. I have so many soft blankets. Like it's just, I have all the strategies. I use them all. So
That's good. I was hoping to get some tips because recently, oh, things have been heavy here. Yeah, it's heavy. Hearing just day in, day out, there's a lot of desperation here. With the situation on the border, a lot of asylum seekers they're sticking with it. A lot of people have given up. In the early days, one person who returned to like a very violent situation back home said, "Well, I'd rather die there with my family than die here on the border where I don't know anybody." So yeah, it's heavy. I think one of the things that that really gives me life and keeps me going is every weekday we have mass in our community in the evening, and so I really use that time to bring to mind people I met during the day and pray for their situation, pray for their intentions, for their strength, for their perseverance, and for their safety. So that's been for me like grounding myself in prayer has been something that keeps me going. And then also the people you work with don't let you quit. They don't quit, so I can't quit.
Well, I'm in DC, and so I'm not interacting with people who are impacted by these policies on a day-to-day basis. I'm not hearing their stories every day. I hear their stories through our partners, but I do feel like I'm insulated a bit because I'm policy focused. But still, you know, that comes with its own frustrations as you're meeting with members of Congress and feel like you're beating your head against the wall. So there are frustrations and a need to do some self-care. I think part of it is knowing what you're getting into and having the right expectations, knowing that you're one of many people that are working towards a common goal, that you are a drop in the bucket. You are a step along the road to greater justice for migrants. And so not expecting that you're going to see these seismic changes in a 6-month period. And so it's managing your expectations is important. And taking comfort in small victories. You know, the Solidarity Across Borders campaign that my office was running just featured a lot of testimonies from migrants, and most of them were in Spanish and needed English voiceovers. And so I recruited a lot of my friends and family members to do the English voiceovers for me, who were aware of what my job was, but didn't really have much knowledge of what specifically it was that I worked on, or what were the relevant issues. I mean, they were probably aware of some of the sound bites that have come out of the White House, and that generally there was an anti-immigrant bent to policies and the attitude, but you know, they were not aware of policies like MPP. They were or Remain in Mexico. They were not aware of Operation Streamline. They're not aware of the denial rates of certain judges in the immigration courts. I mean, there are just quite a number of things that they didn't know were going on, and were very impacted on hearing the stories and doing the voiceovers for me. And so, you know, that really encourages me to be able to bring more people into this movement, get more people fired up about injustices that are facing migrants, and getting more people to in whatever way they can, you know, meeting people where they are, in how they might be ready to engage in some advocacy, participating in a campaign, sending in a postcard, voting, you know, being a more informed voter. And so that really is something that helps to keep me going, is to focus on the smaller victories, because the smaller victories add up to big ones.
Oh, that is wonderful advice. Thank you. And for those who are listening to our conversation, we have links to all of the organizations here that you can research if you want to volunteer or donate in whatever capacity, if you feel so inspired. I do want to go back to Caitlin Marie's mention of Washington, but before we do that, we have another question, and this is for Kara. If you could talk a little bit more about the outbreaks at Batavia and how they were treated. And I know that you and I, Kara, have talked about people who have been released from Batavia under conditions due to COVID, but then have since faced deportation issues. And I just wondered if you could maybe explain a little more about how COVID has directly impacted Batavia and detainees and deportations from Buffalo.
Yeah, so when the pandemic began, there was a big push from a lot of different organizations to try to get ICE to release people. This was happening all over the country in all carceral systems. So, and there was a big push with local lawyers and advocates, particularly to get people out who were medically vulnerable. There was some success. Some people were able to be released who had some kind of condition that made them more high risk to COVID. Others continue to be there who have diabetes and cancer and cardiac issues, and they're very scared. So I'm unclear as to why some people were allowed out, and it particularly in the beginning, and others weren't. And the way that it was treated there, was that part of the question? Yeah, so again, this comes from the people who we interact with through the phone line, or through, they have a tablet and letters and various things, but people were terrified. They could watch about COVID on the news. They knew when people were sick. Some people were hospitalized. And again, the treatment for it was pretty much to put people into solitary confinement. There wasn't a lot of information or help going around. And the sense is that in some ways it got better. They were provided some kinds of hygiene and stuff, but again, there's no social distancing and everything. And there has been, I think Caitlin Marie mentioned this, but particularly recently, the amount of deportations has increased astronomically. In the past 2 months, so many people have been deported, and it's very hard to keep track. Like, someone will call the phone line and the next day they're gone. You know, they're allowed by regulation to be sent a suitcase full of just like a change of clothes, basic things for when they are deported. But most people that we've been talking to, if they're lucky, get like 24 hours notice sometimes, or they're shipped to another facility and then another facility and then they're transferred. So like it's just been one person who had an order for deportation was telling me that it just felt like for him and the people he was talking to, like the administration is trying to get as many people out as possible. Like it just felt like a purge in some kind of ways. So
following up on that, Kara, and also Caitlin Marie, things that you have mentioned, although some of us believe the election has been settled, many in this country feel it has not. Were the administration to change to a Biden-Harris administration, do you envision, well, I guess, what do you anticipate changing with a different administration? And to follow up with what Kara said, do you envision in the intervening 2 months things getting worse before the new administration, if there is such, comes in? And I know I'm asking you to look into a crystal ball that's very dark and cloudy, but it'd be perhaps useful to have your perspective on what you think might happen in the next 2 months, and then should there be a change in administration, what you think that might look like for the work that we do.
I do think that you'll see a shift with a new administration. I think the number one thing will be a change in rhetoric, which I think makes a big difference. We're not going to see this characterization of all immigrants as violent criminals, a demonization of them, as an invasion. We're not going to hear that kind of language, and so I think that there will be a cultural shift that happens in the White House. Biden has made a number of promises. I do think that despite being thought of as a moderate himself, I think that some of his more progressive colleagues in the Democratic Party have challenged him and pushed him to make more commitments to immigrant communities. So he's promised things like ending the Remain in Mexico policy, a temporary moratorium on deportations. I expect to see something on DACA. I expect to see something on TPS, an extension of protections, TPS being the folks who have temporary protective status. So they might have been granted some legal status and work permits as a result of a natural disaster that they might have suffered in their countries. And many people who have TPS have been in the United States for 20 plus years and have US citizen children. And so I expect to see a cancellation of those a cancellation of the cancellation of TPS so that people can stay. I think that the challenges that Biden will face, so I think what we can see is a reversal of a lot of the executive actions that Trump has taken. I think that will take a little bit longer than we'd like, because a lot of these changes are through the rules process. And so that requires you've got to draft the rule, you've got to publish the draft rule, you've got to wait for public comments, you've got to evaluate those public comments. There could be litigation, as there has been throughout the Trump administration. So Biden has the ability to reverse a lot of the executive actions. It could just take a bit longer. I do think that we'll be able to quickly see things like ending more people being sent to Mexico under MPP. I'm not sure how long it will take, though, to parole the 15,000 or so folks who are currently subject to it. I'm not sure how long it will take to parole them into the United States. I think we'll see some pretty quick action to protect DACA and TPS. I think as soon as he's able to, he will raise the ceiling for refugees. It's the lowest it has ever been at 15,000. Biden has committed to 125,000 as the ceiling, which he can easily do. So I expect to see those kinds of things. If he's dealing with a Republican-controlled Senate, though, he's going to have a lot of difficulty doing anything legislative. So I'm not expecting to see, a pathway to citizenship for undocumented, or even DACA or TPS, which should be kind of the low-hanging fruit. There has been bipartisan legislation out there, but it's just stalled. And we're still dealing with a very polarized political scenario. It's yet to be seen what the Republican Party looks like post-Trump, if it's still very controlled by Trump. If that's the case, immigration, getting anything done via immigration becomes even more difficult. And you've got to also think about the number one priority is going to be COVID. And getting COVID under control, expanding testing, tracing, vaccine, and maybe another stimulus. So, Biden's got only so much political capital, and he's got to figure out how he can spend that wisely. So I do think that there'll be kind of this easing. We won't feel as advocates, oh my gosh, what's coming next, and just feeling bombarded. But I don't know that we're going to see a 180 turn. Something that is often mentioned is you've got to remember that Obama's nickname was the deporter in chief. He deported about 3 million people over the course of his 8 years. Context is everything. And so he did set priorities, and a lot of those deportations were recent border crossers and people with criminal convictions. However, recent border crossers could be people that as immigrant advocates, we may find to be very sympathetic. This is the context that he's coming from, and we need to keep that in mind and temper our expectations, but also be ready to feel the need to continue to be advocating and to be fighting for immigrant rights. It's it's not sort of there is a sigh of relief, but it's not like, oh, now our work is done. The work will shift. I think psychologically it will be easier, but it's still an uphill battle.
Thank you for that, for Caitlin Marie. Yes, I feel I can breathe a bit easier, but I also know there is still so much work to do, and we still have 2 months before anything hopefully changes.
Yeah, I actually would be concerned about what's going to happen in the next 2 months, because I think he's going to try to do as much as he can to preserve as much of his legacy as possible, and presenting the United States as a place that is not friendly to immigrants is something that is important to his legacy. And you can kind of see that if you look at the numbers of people who are applying for green cards, for example, or for visas, that it's gone down. People are got the message that U.S. is not friendly to newcomers. So I could never have predicted some of the policies that we're seeing now. I couldn't have predicted Remain in Mexico. I couldn't have predicted that there would be so-called safe third country agreements, making people from Guatemala force them to request asylum in Honduras. I can't guess what the exact policy will look like. My brain just doesn't go there. But I am nervous to see what happens as they do their best to preserve the legacy and make as many of the changes that they've enacted over the last 4 years as long lasting and as permanent as possible.
Yes, thank you, Caitlin Marie. Kara or Jarrett, do you want to weigh in on any anticipations for the coming administration?
Sure. I agree with Caitlin Marie on all that, especially just keeping in mind what happened under Obama, because we know that Joe Biden was Obama's running mate to provide like a center right balance to Obama, who is seen as too leftist to win moderate votes. Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of work to do. We all breathed a sigh of relief. A week ago, a little over a week ago, when Stephen Miller had his interview and talked about all the different executive orders that were ready to be signed. I read it because I must be like masochistic, I don't know, but oh my gosh, my stomach dropped reading those plans. I'm very grateful that they won't come to fruition. My hot take, really spicy hot take, is I hope that Trump pursues all the frivolous lawsuits that he wants, so he focuses on that and not on a scorched earth campaign. That's my hot take.
I like that hot take, so thank you for sharing that. Kara, any thoughts on the administration?
Just to echo everything that Caitlin Marie and Jared said, that was very well put. Things will get easier in some ways, and then on the other, like as both of you said, like this was a weapon that was already created and had been used for decades. Like Bill Clinton did devastating things to the immigration system, his administration did, and so it was all, the Trump administration just like refined it into the cruelest weapon possible to hurt as many people in as many like intricate ways. It was like watching Saw, listening to the news sometimes or something. But yeah, there shouldn't be detention centers. Like immigrants shouldn't be held in prison. There's such a long way to go. There's so much work to do. And my hope is, like, whatever happens with this administration, that people continue to feel energized to do this work and to stand in solidarity with people who will continue to need it.
Thank you for that hopeful message. I think the last question or for discussion, and it follows up on what Kara and the rest of you were saying. I'm concerned about a certain sense of complacency that, oh, we've done it, we got rid of, and a sense of maybe also burnout, which is legitimate, of stopping the work that needs to be done right at the moment when we need to do so much more to keep pushing. And so I guess my question for you to sort of end our conversation is something that Caitlin Marie had mentioned about the rhetoric, and that there will be a change of rhetoric. But given that such a large percentage of our fellow citizens voted in a particular way, I'm wondering what we can do to help change not just an administration's rhetoric, but a civil rhetoric in our society that relates to these issues. And how do we concientizar? How do we raise the consciousness of, or awaken people to, these cruel realities? Any thoughts on language, rhetoric, representation as we round out our conversation this evening?
I have these are not my own thoughts. This is the hot take of Twitter right now that I'm going to resuscitate. But yesterday I was reading something that N.K. Jemisin wrote, who's an amazing Black science fiction writer. And she was talking about exactly that. And her take was a response to people who are saying, like, reach out across the aisle and reach out to Trump supporters and everything. And she's like, you can't reach out to people who question the right for your very existence, right? You just can't. But sorry, there's cats happening. You can talk to the people who may be more apt to think everything's okay right now because Biden gets elected, or, you know, to just moderates, right? And she said that one of the ways that she's thinking about doing is just how do you tell better stories? And like, how do you tell stories that are like in this world where everything is like, you take it into immediately and you get hot takes, right? How do you tell the kind of nuanced, thoughtful stories about like real humans and years of wretched immigration policy and economic policies and wars? Like, how do you tell all of these things in some kind of way that people can take it in the same way that they can, you know, take in like lock her up and, you know, things that are easy to like grasp onto and remember. Like, how do we? That's a question to a question. But again, I think like thinking about how to tell stories and to people who are able to listen is really important.
Well, Pope Francis talks a lot about creating a culture of encounter, which I think is crucial when it comes to trying to educate and move people to advocate on behalf of immigrants, a people coming from a situation that most of our networks, our personal networks, are very unfamiliar with. And so just creating as many opportunities for encounter, whether that's through immersion trips or a speaker at your parish or telling more stories, the more we can expose people to the stories of immigrants, I think the more impact that we can have. You know, I don't think that we should underestimate the power of public opinion, and we should do all we can to shape public opinion. And you know, you need to meet people where they are. And so I don't know that a goal should be converting people, changing people's minds. I'm just not sure that we'll be successful in that. But this election showed us that you know, when people are educated about the issues, they can be motivated to then participate in the political process when they haven't done so before. If we just look at turnout. And so, you know, I think about you know, my family and my friends who did the voiceovers for me, who were not terribly engaged in these issues before, but really became motivated to do something more because they learned about it. They probably were inclined to have viewed immigrants sympathetically before, but because they didn't really have an opportunity and because they didn't have a personal story or a face that they could sort of attach to the policy, it was easy to set it aside, put it on the back burner. So putting human faces to it, having people know that they're advocating for someone. And then I think it's important to remain open. You know, you may not be able to change people's minds right now, but they may change their minds on their own. And so just always remaining open to saying, you know what, we disagree on this. I can't see that point of view, but you know what, if you ever want to learn something more about immigrants, you ever want to learn a little bit more about my work, you ever want to know what it is that people are fleeing from when they come seeking asylum at our borders, let me know. I'm happy to hook you up with organizations that do this kind of work, and you can see it for yourself. So I think that if we remain open, that we can start to set the country on a road towards reconciliation and be in a more positive place.
Thank you, Caitlin. Marie, Jarrett?
Sure. It's tough. I actually yesterday was watching a documentary with the swing voters who went from voting for Obama to voting for Trump, and where they were at, and then where they were at 2 years into Trump's administration, and listening to what was going on with them, and were they happy with the way that the country was in 2018, I believe it was. And there was some times when people were talking about immigration, one of the people just said, like, that's not my problem, why should I care? And it's easy to write off, like, well, how do you teach people empathy? It seems like an impossible task, but I think what Caitlin Marie was talking about, encounter is very, very important. Personal encounter is integral, and like, I think part of that is also like recognizing what are the underlying values that people are coming into with their discourses, whether they be like anti-immigrant or what have you, and finding like ways to dialogue and common ground there. One of the things that we do with immersion groups here is take them to speak to ranchers on the border who are pro-wall. The folks that they speak to are not flaming xenophobes. They favor humanitarian aid, but they also like fear for their safety because cartels have murdered their neighbors. And so that underlying value of safety is something that we can connect with people who are fleeing violence in their homes and are waiting here on the border. Another thing that very recently I felt is like, this is going to be somewhat spicy, so bear with me. Woker than thou doesn't help. I was with a group recently, and everything was going great. Then I shared a document authored by the Samaritans, one of the humanitarian aid groups along the border, and Francisco Cantu, who's an ex Border Patrol agent who wrote a book and left the Border Patrol and now works for immigrant justice. And he does visits to detention centers all the time here. And so the document was about writing people in detention centers, and it had a list of people that had wanted contact, wanted someone to write them. And the reaction I got was very, very angry that I would even suggest a document written by this man who's an oppressor and XYZ. And I was thinking, well, if people can't, this guy agrees with you on everything. If just his pen like makes you not want to interact with this document, which has a list of people who are waiting to speak with someone, to write someone, to have someone reach out to them, how in the world are you going to dialogue with someone who doesn't agree with you? And so we can very much, I mean, dogmatism is not a thing that only exists on the conservative end. And I think we have to be very wary of feeling that we're the righteous ones and that we're above scapegoating, because we can very easily fall into that too. And so that's something I would want to end on.
Well, thank you for that, Jarrett. I like the idea of telling stories. I mean, after all, I'm a literature professor and I believe strongly in the power of stories. Speaking of which, Jarrett, I believe one of your partner colleagues, or I think she just retired, Maria Ingracia Robles, doesn't she have a book coming out about stories from the border?
She does. She has not retired. She can't be in the Comedor right now because of COVID. She is one of the sisters, missionary sisters of the Eucharist, who's publishing a book. It's kind of been her dream the last decade since Kino was founded of publishing publishing people's testimony, and so her book's coming out in March, and I think that it's going to be really cool once it gets published.
Well, I look forward to that, and I hope that she will continue to publicize that on Facebook, which is where I first heard about it. So. Thank you to our panelists for participating in this very informative, challenging, but also energizing discussion about COVID and migration. I want to tell our viewers that if they are interested in learning more, the websites are both in this stream and also on the Canisius Borders and Migrations webpage, where you can find out more. And to remind people of our final Borders and Migrations event for the fall, which will be next week. The information is on Facebook, social media, and on the blog page. That event, however, is in Spanish, as it features panelists talking about the Mexican perspective of migration to the United States. So thank you all. It's been a pleasure to learn from you and be in solidarity with you. And I wish you well. Please be safe as things continue to deteriorate in terms of COVID. And I wish you well as we continue to do the good work. And I hope we can partner again in the future.